Hello and welcome back to the APUS History Curriculum for Era 8. In this video, we will be looking at the African American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, which was a continuation of the efforts from the 1940s and 1950s that we covered back in Topic 8.6. So let's get to it. Numerous individuals had emerged from the early Civil Rights Movement in the decades before, including the integration of the armed forces in 1948, and the Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. In 1955, Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white customer, resulting in her arrest and the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. A young preacher from Atlanta, Martin Luther King Jr., joined that effort and thus became a prominent figure in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Civil Rights Movement. He had traveled throughout the South, organizing the people to fight segregation and disenfranchisement through nonviolent civil disobedience. In 1963, he led a march in Birmingham, Alabama, where Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor was determined to suppress any demonstrations. Under his orders, city police used high-pressure fire hoses, police dogs, and other brutal tactics to disperse the crowds. This violence was not limited to adult protesters. Even children participating in the Children's Crusade were targeted. The scenes were horrific, but that was precisely the point. Footage of these brutal actions spread across the nation on television and in newsreels, stirring public outrage and generating widespread sympathy for the Civil Rights Movement. King was arrested, and from his jail cell, he wrote a letter that justified the direct actions that these civil rights leaders were taking. King criticized those who were asking for gradual change and emphasized that the need for change was urgent, saying injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This shift in public opinion following Birmingham was significant in getting key civil rights legislation passed in the following years. The key moment in his nonviolent activism was the August 1963 March on Washington, where King gave his I Have a Dream speech before more than 200,000 activists who were gathered between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. In the speech, King expressed his desire for a society defined by equality. In the years before his assassination in April of 1968, King advocated for a shift towards economic justice and the eradication of poverty, arguing that civil rights were meaningless without economic rights. The direct action and nonviolent tactics advocated by Parks and King were also common amongst others in the civil rights movement. In the 1960 lunch counter sit-ins at the Woolworth department store in Greensboro, North Carolina, the college students that carried them out faced harassment, violence, and arrest, but remained peaceful to show their commitment to nonviolence. Freedom Riders, sponsored by the Congress of Racial Equality, rode Greyhound buses throughout the South to protest against local segregation rules that violated recent Supreme Court decisions. They faced violence, including beatings and bombings, as well as arrest, and helped focus national attention on the continued segregation and intimidation faced by Black Southerners. Despite the efforts of many in the civil rights movement, there were still high levels of resistance amongst many whites to their goals, which in turn sparked debate within the movement over the efficacy of their actions. In the area of voting, many southern states made it difficult to register to vote. For example, in Mississippi, only 2% of eligible black voters were actually registered, which was typical across the South. Poll taxes were quite common, which targeted poor people. Now, of course, there were poor whites, too, but there were often charitable organizations that would pay the poll taxes for white voters. Literacy tests were also often used to prevent black voters from participating in the political process. Alabama was one example of a state that required a literacy test. Some states, like Tennessee, used what were labeled as grandfather clauses to prohibit blacks from voting. A grandfather clause will generally prohibit anyone from voting if their ancestors were ineligible to vote prior to 1867. Since the first mention of former slaves having the right to vote did not occur until the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, it is clear who was targeted by these grandfather clauses. To address the issue in Mississippi and other states that used the poll tax, the 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which banned the practice, was added in 1964. Voting rights marches, like the one from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, were faced with violence, and the organizers of many of these actions saw their homes and even churches attacked and firebombed. The 16th Street Baptist Church, where organizers of the Birmingham March had met, was bombed in September of 1963, resulting in the deaths of 4 young girls, ages 11 to 14, who were attending choir practice. U.S. Air Force veteran James Meredith tried to enroll at the University of Mississippi and was blocked from doing so by the governor until JFK sent troops to enforce a federal court order allowing him to register. Alabama Governor George Wallace personally blocked the entrance to the University of Alabama to prevent it from being integrated. Kennedy nationalized the Alabama National Guard and got Wallace to step aside, although Wallace continued to resist desegregation, having promised, quote, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He later ran for president on a third-party ticket in 1968, getting 46 electoral votes, all from the Deep South. White supremacist groups, like the KKK, attacked black residents, as well as whites who came to assist in the voting rights movement. Several volunteers in the Mississippi Freedom Summer voter registration drive were abducted, shot, and buried in shallow graves. Prominent civil rights activist Medgar Evers was assassinated outside of his home. And on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated while standing in front of his hotel room in Memphis, Tennessee. With the violence against those participating in the civil rights movement increasing, some began to question the effectiveness of the nonviolent form of protest. Those who adopted a more confrontational approach were part of the Black Power movement. They sought Black autonomy, Black communities relying on themselves rather than on predominantly white institutions, economic empowerment, focusing on Black-owned businesses and opportunities, and cultural pride, rediscovering Black culture and teaching it to the next generation. They said that integration with white society was not the way to freedom, but that the way to freedom involved separatism and militarism. At the forefront of this movement were organizations like the Nation of Islam, also called the Black Muslims, led by Elijah Muhammad, which advocated separation of Black and white Americans. Their most visible member was Malcolm X, who criticized the early civil rights movement for being too focused on integration. He supported the idea of Black separatism, embracing their own culture and identity, and belief that the Black communities could best solve their own problems if they remained separate from white society. Eventually, he broke with the Nation of Islam and adopted a more inclusive version of Black liberation, with whites as allies. This led to his assassination by members of the Nation of Islam in 1965. Another organization in the Black Power movement was the Black Panthers. They were established by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California in early 1966. Although they were well known for their open display of weapons, military-style dress, and focus on police brutality and racist government policies, they also worked in local communities to run survival programs that provided food, clothing, and even medical treatment. Many of these groups would be blamed for the rise in urban violence and riots that occurred in the mid to late 60s. Between 1964 and 1968, there were 329 riots in 257 cities across the nation, including the 1965 riots in Watts, a predominantly Black neighborhood in Los Angeles. There, thousands of businesses were destroyed, and 34 people were killed over 6 days of rioting in August of that year. Most of them African Americans killed by LAPD and the National Guard, which was called out to restore order. More riots took place during the tense hot summers of 1966 and 1967. Although the popular belief was that the Black Power movement had something to do with all of this, and in particular the Watts riots, an investigation into the cause of it determined that it was primarily poverty and racism that was at the root of the violence. The federal government had attempted to address some of the problems of segregation and discrimination. Months after the March on Washington, Congress finally passed the long-stalled Civil Rights Act of 1964. It sought to promote greater racial equality by prohibiting segregation in all public facilities. It also prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, sex, or religion. A year later, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act in direct response to the violence faced by marchers attempting to go from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That law prohibited states from passing laws that disenfranchised protected groups and provided for federal oversight of elections in areas where a history of discrimination existed. The 24th Amendment was also added to the Constitution, as I've already mentioned, which specifically prohibited the collection of poll taxes, a tool often used to disenfranchise the poor. Congress passed more civil rights legislation in 1968, addressing housing discrimination, making it illegal to refuse to sell or rent a dwelling to any person because of their race, color, religion, or national origin. Even the Supreme Court began to address the issue of civil rights, ruling on numerous cases that expanded various protections. The 1962 case of Baker v. Carr prohibited gerrymandering congressional districts on the basis of race. The case of Loving v. Virginia in 1967 struck down state laws that prohibited interracial marriage. Citing the slow progress made in desegregating schools in the landmark 1971 case of Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, the court ruled that school districts had a duty to actively desegregate schools, and that busing students across district lines was a legitimate means of achieving that goal. Well, that about covers what you need to know about topic 8.10, the African American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.